This is our lecture number 20. We're going to be taking a look at the history of intelligence. And I think there's no more controversial area in the study of psychology than that of intelligence and intelligence testing. And what I want to do is to try to give you a little bit of perspective on this in terms of history and talk about some of these older standardized tests that, in a sense, psychology staked its reputation on. And then how this evolved into some other types of tests that we now use today that we consider to be a much better reflection of an individual's human abilities. So let's get into an examination of this by asking a couple of questions. First question is, why is it that these standardized tests, like the Stanford-Binet, which we'll learn about, like the WAIS and the WISC test, why have they fallen out of favor, and why are they not considered really to be a good measure of intelligence today? And secondly, why are we at this point in time more inclined to examine intelligence and other human abilities more broadly by things like what we call emotional intelligence and cognitive intelligence? So those are two important questions we hope to ask as we go along. Some of the problems in this area are related to how we go about defining intelligence. And I always begin this by talking about a friend of mine, a long-time friend who, if you take a look at his history and his background, he really had very little in terms of formal schooling. He left high school at an early age, didn't even get his completion for his high school degree, GRD, and took on a series of jobs after he was in the service, and served very admirably, and then took on some jobs, started out at the very bottom in the telephone company, and rose to the ranks ultimately of being a regional director, and indeed did very well in terms of his position. But this was an individual who really had very little in terms of formal schooling. And I consider him to be one of the most intelligent people that I know. He can fix anything. He just knows how to fix anything that's electrical, anything that's mechanical. I have things that go wrong in my house from time to time, like an air conditioning system or something with my furnace, or just the normal kinds of things that happen in a house that ordinarily people have to hire someone in order to try to rectify, to fix it. And yet he, whenever I call upon him, he's always there, and he knows so much and has learned so much about how to troubleshoot, how to fix things, how to analyze relatively complicated problems and then find solutions for them. But yet his formal schooling was very meager. So again, that prompts us to explore what we exactly mean by this whole concept of intelligence. So after reflecting upon this a little bit, I've kind of arrived at this definition, that it's a general mental capability, and typically involves the ability to reason. It involves being able to develop a very organized and well thought out plan. It's about problem solving. It's about being able to think abstractly. It's about being able to understand very complex ideas. It's about the ability to learn quickly and learn from experience. So again, I think that part of the problem that we've had in the whole field of the study of intelligence is, how we've attempted to try to define it. And I think that this definition that you see here is one that I think encompasses a good deal in terms of what we actually mean by intelligence, which really goes beyond book smarts. Something that we'll talk about a little bit more as we go along. So that being said, let's take a look at a little bit of this history. Sir Francis Galton, certainly British philosopher and psychologist, was the first to really try to begin to develop intelligence tests. And he was very much interested in the problem of nature-nurture. He's very much interested in the problem of studying genius and studying greatness. Prior to the time of Galton, intelligence was measured in a variety of different ways, like reaction time, for example. As you see here, a person who could react more quickly in this kind of a situation was considered to be smarter than an individual who could not react as quick. Being able to estimate the passage of time, for example, people that were very good at doing this without having any kind of assistance in terms of a watch or any other way to try to tell time, those individuals were considered to be smarter than others who couldn't estimate the passage of time as well. So again, a variety of different, very crude ways of assessing intelligence. And then comes Galton, really, and his desire to try to create an intelligence test. After Galton, and indeed, Galton had his stab at it, but never really developed any tests that were considered to be reliable and valid, and we'll talk about those two concepts later on. They're essential in terms of developing any kind of tests, but Alfred Binet and William Simon were the first really to develop a test, a reliable intelligence test. And if you take a look at this history, this is something that occurs in 1905. Theodore Simon, excuse me, I said William. Theodore Simon created the first, along with Binet, created the first usable intelligence test in France. And they were commissioned by the chief of education in Paris in order to develop such a test. And again, prior to Binet and Simon, intelligence was measured by all these very crude ways. Another one I didn't mention, the ability to remember lists of nonsense syllables, for example. The more of them that you could remember after being shown a list, supposedly you're smarter than an individual who could not remember as many of them. So they were the first really to develop a test that was used with French, actually Parisian school children. That's where it started. And in the original Simon and Binet test, the primary purpose of this test was try to identify kids who needed help. Mentally retarded children, as was described at that time. And again, so they could be given special attention and special help. I think this is important to recognize this, because modern versions of IQ tests have really become instruments of exclusion. Instead of this lofty, admirable goal of, trying to detect those individuals who need help and then devote a lot of resources in order to give them help. Now, in the modern era, I think IQ tests and their different versions, different iterations of IQ tests really have become about, how can we devise something that's going to exclude individuals from opportunities. So again, the goal back in the time of Binet and Simon was very different than the goal of today. And I think it's very important to recognize that difference. So in the original Binet-Simon test, Binet gives this test to a large number of para school children, and he creates a standard for each age group that's based upon this data. So for example, as I show here on the slide, if 70% of 8-year-olds could pass a particular test, then success on that test represented the 8-year-old level of intelligence. So this is how it was done. So for each age group now, it's this 70% pass rate, and there are questions that are used for each one of these age groupings. So when you take a look at examples from the first Binet-Simon test, and again, these test items are being grouped on the basis of age and the age at which most children could complete them. If you take a look at what a 3-year-old should be able to do, they should be able to show you their nose, their eyes, and their mouth. They should be able to repeat 2 digits. They should be able to describe objects in a picture. They should be able to give their family name. They should be able to repeat a sentence of 6 syllables. So again, this is just an example of some of the test items. And again, the pass rate is 70%. At 6 years of age, a child should be able to distinguish between morning and afternoon. They should be able to define objects in terms of their use. They should be able to copy a shape. They should be able to count out 13 pennies. They should be able to compare faces in terms of an aesthetic point of view, that is, what looks angry, what looks happy, and so on. So again, this is just a small sampling of those items that were retained for the 6-year-old age grouping. If you take a look at some older ages, 9 years of age, a child should be able to define objects in terms broader than their use, should be able to recognize all the pieces of the monetary system that they use. They should be able to name the months. They should be able to understand easy questions. That's at 9 years of age. And again, this is just a sampling of the many items that are on that test for that age. At 12 years of age, they should be able to use 3 words in a sentence. Give them 3 words, they should be able to construct a sentence out of it. They should be able to recall more than 60 words in 3 minutes. They should be able to define abstract terms, understand a sentence that has been disarranged, that's been mixed up, and should be able to put it back together again. So again, this is what was included on the first Binet-Simon test. When we take a look at exactly how this translates into how we go about assessing kids at a particular age. If a child of 11 years of age scored like an average 8-year-old, they were considered to be 3 years retarded in terms of their mental development. If, on the other hand, a child of 9 years of age scored like an average 10-year-old, they were considered to be 1 year advanced in terms of their mental development. So again, this is what was done during this time, 1905. Again, the first widely used standard intelligence test used in Paris, France, and then ultimately in the rest of France, in other European countries as well. And then along comes a German philosopher and scientist by the name of William Stern, who developed something that's called the intelligence quotient. And the intelligence quotient is simply this formula that you see here, mental age, again, as assessed by these standardized tests, the one that was created by Binet and Simon, divided by chronological age times 100 equals IQ. And this is simply done in order to remove a decimal point. Right? So let me give you some examples here. A child who has a mental age of 10, again, as assessed by those standardized tests by Binet and Simon, divided by their chronological age of 10 times 100, that equals 100. That's the average. Okay, this is an individual that's performing consistent with their chronological age. A mental age of 5 and a chronological age of 10 times 100, that equals 50. That's 50 IQ points below the norm of 100. 10 mental age of 10 divided by chronological age of 5 times 100 equals this very, very high IQ of 200. So again, now what we're trying to do is essentially put a tape measure to the mind by way of the development of this mathematical formula, again, which is called IQ, Williams-Stern. The Binet-Simon test is imported to the United States in 1916 at Stanford University. Psychologist Lewis Terman, who you see there, adapts this test. And a little bit about Lewis Terman. He very strongly believed that IQ was inherited. And what you should note about this is that Binet and Simon really said nothing about inheritance, said nothing about there being a genetic component to intelligence. They weren't concerned with it at all. Again, their major concern was that of trying to detect individuals that needed help. So again, Lewis Terman, now psychologist at Stanford University, believes that IQ is inherited. He wants to use this to classify developmentally disabled children as one means for doing this. His tests were used in a mass way to administer to World War I recruits. Which has some very important implications in and of itself, not the least of which is that individuals who tended to score low, for the most part, were on the front lines, whereas those individuals who tended to score higher were given desk jobs. And indeed, that is how this all played out here in the United States in terms of the Stanford, now called the Stanford-Binet test, again, 1916. One of the primary purposes of utilizing the Stanford-Binet test in our own country at this time was to classify children and put them on appropriate job tracks. So, for example, those individuals who were scored well, who were thought might be college material, they were given a very different curriculum than those individuals who didn't score as well. They were given a less challenging curriculum. So again, this had important implications for how students were tracked and how they were treated and the kinds of curriculum that they were exposed to and the expectations that we had for them during this period of time. He also published a book which was called The Genetic Study of Genius. He was one of the first individuals to argue that being a gifted child is really something that's in your genes. And unfortunately, this was used to a great extent by individuals who were interested in the eugenics movement. And indeed, Lewis Terman was very much involved in that movement. In other words, those individuals that are very intelligent, they're the ones who should marry one another and have children, because it's likely that their children are going to be very smart, as opposed to individuals who don't test as high. They should be encouraged not to have children. So this eugenics movement then was something that was really a product of what was happening here in the United States with the Stanford-Binet test and how it was utilized by psychologists like Lewis Terman. So again, his support of the eugenics movement was something that was, I think, disastrous in this country, and certainly led to some of the elements that we saw in the rise of Germany and the Holocaust and the desire on the part of the Nazi government to also want to promote eugenics. So that being said, if we take a look at some of the sample items on the Stanford-Binet test, like what you see here, for example, the older the test taker, the more the test requires, verbal comprehension and fluency. So, for example, at the age of 4, a person taking the test should fill in the missing word when asked. Brother is a boy, sister is, of course, a girl. They should be answer correctly when asked, why do we have houses? Obviously to provide us with protection and comfort. At the age of 9, they should correctly answer this. In an old graveyard in Spain, they have discovered a small skull which they believe to be that of Christopher Columbus when he was about 10 years old. What is foolish about that? Well, Christopher Columbus was much older than that when he passed away. Here's another question. The examiner presents folded paper. The child draws how it will look unfolded. So again, at 9 years of age, again, this is just a sampling, of some of the items on the Stanford-Binet test. At the age of 12, they should be able to complete this sentence. The streams are dry. There's been little rain. Again, what is foolish about that? Tell what is foolish about this statement. Bill Jones' feet are so big that he has to put his trousers on over his head. Well, clearly, that's impossible. Okay. As an adult, can they describe the difference between misery and poverty, character and reputation, laziness and idleness? They should be able to explain how to measure 3 pints of water with a 5-pint and 2-pint can. So again, these are all the things that were very much a part of the Stanford-Binet test at this time. So the use of these tests was used very widely by the U.S. military, and again, distinctions between who does well and who does not well can really determine your fate. You perform poorly and you're going to be on the front lines. If you perform well, then you're going to get a desk job back in the United States. That was the simple fact of it. When we take a look at the use of IQ tests, again, to screen immigrants, that too has its own array of problems. IQ tests were used outside the military with individuals of all ages, all backgrounds, all nationalities. When you begin to take a look at the screening of new immigrants, for example, as they entered the United States, at one point our government said that 79% of Italians and 80% of Hungarians, 83% of Jews, and 87% of Russians were feeble-minded. This was outlandish. And the reason why it was outlandish is because those tests, for the most part, were in English. So again, we have these sweeping, inaccurate generalizations that are being made about entire populations. Intelligence experts at that time were testifying in Congress, encouraging Congress to enact immigration restrictions based upon these numbers in terms of who was passing these standardized IQ tests, and clearly it was something that was discriminatory. So problems with the early IQ test, biased against people who don't have English as their first language. And again, many of these immigrants obviously didn't. And it was also biased against children. Their language, their mathematical skills simply are very immature. So again, lots of problems with testing, at this time. Then along in the 1950s comes Columbia psychologist David Wechsler. And Wechsler develops some standardized tests that are now probably the most widely used ones, not only here in the United States, but throughout the world. He divided the concept of intelligence into 2 parts, one a verbal part and another a performance, or what we would call a nonverbal part. And he really developed 3 tests. One, which is called the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. You'll very frequently see this acronym right here, WAIS. And the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, the WISC, W-I-S-C. And thirdly, and actually more recently, the Wechsler Preschool and Primary Scale of Intelligence Test, WPPSI. That's the acronym for it. So again, these are probably the most popular of all the standardized intelligence tests today, and again, been translated into just about every single language in the world. So again, commonly administered, very commonly administered throughout the world. So I think it's important to take a look at some of the components of this, and no doubt, many of you have probably at one time or another been tested with this particular test. So here's part of this test, the Wechsler Intelligence Test. Again, an individual is shown this image that you see right here. And they're asked to tell what is missing, and clearly the wheel is missing, okay, in this particular picture right here. This is again called picture completion. This is what we call a performance scale. So again, this is a verbal part of the this also is performance scale block design, excuse me, the nonverbal part of this test, using the 16 blocks that you see on the left here. Please, make a pattern out of it, and this is the pattern that can be made. So again, this is another part of the performance scale, or what we call the nonverbal part. Here's another one. Take these pieces like puzzle pieces and develop them into a picture, and the picture is that of an individual sailing a boat on a lake, clouds in the sky, beautiful day. Right? Here's another aspect of the performance scale. This is picture arrangement, where you are asked to arrange these pictures in a particular order that will make sense in terms of telling a logical story. This is called coding, okay, where you're given these symbols right here that are associated with these numbers. And again, then you're asked to fill in the symbols as you go along here. So the 3 corresponds to a star, 5 corresponds to these 2 vertical lines that you see here, parallel lines. The 2 refers to this square that you see. So again, you're asked to enter those in this in these boxes that you see here. So again, putting in the appropriate code in the blank spaces. So again, this is another part of the performance scale. Then on the verbal scale, general information, you're asked how many hours apart are Eastern Standard and Pacific time. So that's 3-hour time difference. In what way are boats and trains alike? Both modes of transportation, obviously. Why do people buy automobile insurance? Again, in order to protect themselves in case they get into an accident. What does the word procrastinate mean? And of course, we all procrastinate, delay doing something when in fact we can get it done oftentimes in a very short period of time, but because we don't like doing it, we procrastinate and don't do it right away. Listen carefully to the following numbers. And when I'm through, I want you to repeat the numbers backwards. So 4, 8, 7, 5, 2. So again, you repeat them backwards. 2, 5, 7, 8, 4. Okay, so this is called digit span, and it's part of the verbal scale. So limitations of standard IQ tests. Well, there are really many limitations. They're biased toward those individuals that are experienced test takers. If you've taken a lot of these tests, you tend to do better. They're biased in favor of people who are highly motivated, who really like to take tests. They don't measure every type of intelligence, and we'll get into that in our next lecture. And they're racially and culturally biased. So again, some very severe limitations of these standard IQ tests. And the basic message here is that we need other ways of doing this. And that's what we will spend time doing in our next lecture.